Hey, Kurt F. Snyder here. I want to share a few thoughts on seat bags versus rack and pannier setup for bike packing and bike touring. I've used both systems quite a bit over the years, and a lot of folks ask, like, why'd you go with this setup for your last trip, or why did you use that setup for? A lot of times, there's a lot of thought that goes into it, and it goes much beyond just how much cargo capacity do I need to have, although that is a big consideration. This is my pivot vault that I just rode from my house here in Arizona to eastern Kansas for the Unbound gravel race. And this was a setup I used for that, an Old Man Mountain divide rack, and these Revel 8 Designs nano pannier on either side of it. And also had this pronghorn dry bag strapped on top with some other stuff. And that setup was fantastic for a ride that was mostly gravel roads and, you know, nothing technical at all, nothing overgrown at all. But for pretty much all the single track trips that I do, all the bikepacking races I do, which are pretty much always on single track these days, I go with a seat bag, usually smaller than this one, but prefer that sort of a setup for single track in most cases. So why one versus the other? Cargo capacity is probably the first thing that I'll think about. And how much stuff do I have to carry? You can fit a lot more on a rack and in panniers than you can in a seat bag. And that is a big factor on a lot of desert trips that I do. I'll end up taking a rack and panniers because I might have to carry 5 days of food and 2+ gallons of water at a given time. And so having all of that in this sort of setup works really well. It's quite comfortable. And on single track trips, I usually have a little bit less to carry, and I'm much more likely to carry a backpack on those trips than I am on, say, a gravel tour, where I'd rather not have a backpack. And so if you can get some of the weight off your back and onto this when you're seated all day, spinning on gravel roads, that can feel really good. For winter trips, you just have so much cargo that you have to carry, you know, lots of food, lots of fuel, big, huge sleeping bag on the back here. So rack and panniers for winter really makes a lot of sense. And the other factor is just kind of ease of access of things. You know, it takes 8 seconds to unclip these, open it, and pull something out or shove something in there, versus if I want to get something that's like right here in the seat bag, it's a little more work to do it. But what about bike handling? That's, I think, the biggest factor for what I think about before finally settling on one versus the other. If I were to go ride a gravel bike like this setup all the way to Kansas with this bag here and a lot of stuff packed into it, that weight is up really high. And honestly, I really don't like the way the bike handles like that. The weight is so high that every time you like rock the bike back and forth or lean a little bit or turn, you feel the bike just pull in the direction that that weight is starting to pull toward gravity. And if on a rack and pannier setup like this, or even just a rack with, say, this bag, this weight is considerably lower than up here. That's a really noticeable difference. And then if you use panniers, I can pack the weight all the way down here. Like, heaviest stuff goes in the bottom, lighter weight stuff in the top. If I have a bag up here, that's usually like sleeping bag or tent, so even lighter yet. So the weight is way down here. So that's like 2 feet lower than if I had a seat bag back here. That's really noticeable with how the bike handles. And I really would prefer this setup in most cases. On single track, this can be a bit of a disadvantage because the pannier sticks out a little bit, so that can get caught on things, or your leg can hit that when you're pushing your bike. You could go with a setup with a rack and just a bag on top like this on trail, which can work really well. One other factor that I don't like as much for single track is that when the weight is as far back as this on the bike, sometimes that can get really noticeable for the bike handling. It feels very rear heavy, and especially if you've ever tried to push a bike loaded like this up a really steep incline, doesn't feel good. So balancing weight from the front of the bike to the rear, and then also not having all the weight like way back here, can be really helpful on steeper single track trails. What else? I think another thing to think about, especially with racks if you're a shorter person, is that your frame just has a much smaller triangle, less space for a frame bag. There's probably less space between the saddle and the rear tire for a seat bag, and especially if you have a full suspension bike, there literally might not be any room there as the rear wheel goes through its travel. And so running a rack like these Old Man Mountain racks can be, instead of mounted up here to the seat collar, you can mount them on the the seat stay right here, and so the whole bike moves up and down with the rear or the whole rack moves up and down with the rear swing arm, and then that gives you so much space for carrying stuff. If you're a shorter person, just don't have as many options for it. So that can be a big advantage to racks for folks of that size. What else? I think that's the short of it. Don't get stuck in any one mindset that for gravel there's one way that you're supposed to do it, or that for single track there's one way that you're supposed to do it. Definitely varies from trip to trip, how much you have to carry, how you want your bike to handle, and the only way to know how the different setups handle is to experiment with it. So definitely encourage you, if you've only ever traveled with a big seat bag here, try a rack and panniers and see what that feels like, or a rack with a bag on top and see what that feels like. It really makes a noticeable difference in a lot of ways, and you'll, I think, be much more able to fine-tune your setup and the way your bike feels if you've spent more time experimenting with it. So let me know if you have any questions on any of that. Happy to try to answer questions down in the comments.